This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
We're going to go to the keynote, which I'm really excited about because I think it's a great way of finishing this question of democracy promotion and looking at exportation of democracy, ? I'm going to very briefly introduce Laurence Whitehead because I don't think there's that much introduction that's required. Just a couple of things. First of all, he's a senior research fellow in politics at Nuffield College, Oxford University, and also a senior fellow of the college. And there's a couple of publications that I want to bring your attention to. The first one is a book which I think the updated edition in 2010, which is Latin America, A New Interpretation, which was by Paul Grave, and I'm sure most of you are aware of that book. And the second one that I want to bring attention to is a recent publication which Jeff was actually talking about before, which was by Hobson and Kirky, edited collection, The Conceptual Politics of Democracy Promotion, which was published by Routledge. And there was Laurence had a chapter in that called On Cultivating Democracy, enlivening the imagery for democracy promotion. A couple of other things. He's the editor of the Oxford University Press series Studies in Democratisation, and he's president of the Conseil Scientifique of the Institut d'Amérique in Paris. Excuse my French pronunciation, I'm sure Nick will correct me on that in the future, and belongs to the steering committee of the Red Euro Latinoamericano de Gobernabilidad para el Desarrollo. So that I did a little bit better. So please, if we could.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you for so many of you staying on after 14 papers. My goodness, I'd have thought you'd be exhausted, but perhaps you're staying on for the wine at 7:20, and I won't stand in the way of that. I will, however, start with one or two points which arise from the CV, because I think they, insofar as I'm entitled to give this talk, they give you a little bit of a sense of the background where I'm coming from. I'm probably, among political scientists, widely known because I was involved in the so-called Transitions from Authoritarian Rule in Latin America and Southern Europe volume, which came out in 1986, very early on. And as far as the democracy promotion side of it was concerned, I did the international chapter, which was about the role of the EU in promoting, in supporting democracy in Southern Europe. So I was a kind of, I'm a dinosaur from the distant past, but I'm also a kind of foundational character in these discussions. And that followed on with a book which was, in fact, as I should mention today, because it was called The Export of Democracy, and it was published in 1990, and it was mainly a series of case studies about Latin America, like the ones that Robert P. was talking about earlier on, and I wrote the concluding chapter of that, which was actually rather more sceptical about mainly at that time about the feasibility, what this export really came down to. So I'm revisiting an old text that was Latin America focused in the light of all the new things that have been happening since then. Later on, I did a book which was called International Dimensions of Democratization in the 1990s, and the key point there was I distinguished between four aspects of, it's not necessarily promotion by an individual state, but of international democratization thought of in international rather than in purely national terms, and those, because the previous literature was nearly all single state, inward looking, the transformation within each state rather than the international dynamics. So and the four categories I proposed were control, conditionality, contagion, and consent. And I would defend the idea that if you're thinking about the international factors shaping and constraining democratization in North Africa or anywhere else, it's still useful, although these have subsequently been refined in various ways, it's still useful to have that array of different kinds of international consideration in mind, not simply export, which would come heavily under the control and conditionality of the first two. And then in 2008, I wrote an article which was published in Democratization, which was very much a reaction to what had happened in Iraq in particular, and was very negative about coercive democratization, and almost saying it's a contradiction in terms. I'll come back to that. And the most recent thing, which is the one that Matt has just referred to, which is the one, in a sense, I will end up talking about in a few minutes, is that the Aberystwyth people produced this book, which is on the conceptual politics of democracy promotion. Came out this year. It costs a huge amount of money, so you might not have bought it yet. You might want to get it from the library. I'm sorry about that. But anyway, it is an approach to the conceptual issues, and within that, I discussed the idea that instead of thinking of export, which is obviously one metaphor you might use for organizing this material, an alternative metaphor, and I'm going to amplify this, would be cultivation of democracy. If you're talking about international influences and practices related to the promotion of democratic change in other countries. So that's where I'm coming from. And in this conference, I should say, compared to the various papers that I've been hearing, I'm clearly more a comparativist than an abstract theorist. I'm certainly not a positivist. I'll defend myself against those kind of accusations. So a lot of the things that the conference is basically trying to do in standing back from the details of practical policy making is very congenial for me. But I suppose my approach, a little bit more than some of the other people here, has been to focus on middle range theories and contextualized generalizations that engage quite strongly with contemporary historical developments in the world as we find it is constantly surprising us by turning out to be. And I'm not, I would say, categorically either a defender of liberal theory or an opponent of liberal theory. I think that there's a wide range of different things that happen within liberal theory, and I think one can borrow from that as well as critique it. So that's a little background. Now, the broad topic of democracy promotion, assistance or export is obviously a label, a category, which is describing and encompassing multiform, dynamic, complex, elusive topics, things which have happened in a variety of different forms in a variety of different contexts. And if we take the post-Second World War, simply, a lot of the thinking about it was inspired initially by such questions as the way the European Union might support the transitions from democracy, from authoritarian rule in Spain, Portugal and Greece. That would be a first one. Later on, how one might cope with the disintegration of the Soviet and the Yugoslav regimes and try to support potentially breakaway states from those federations which might, at least in some of the cases, have the possibility to become more democratic and indeed to join the European Union in some cases. Questions about democracy in the Caribbean, supporting fragile democratic regimes in the Caribbean. And actually, when we get to the 1990s, the theory or the range of cases, the large N universe which people start talking about, becomes quite strongly influenced by something earlier than that. That's to say, what happened to the defeated Axis powers in Italy and Japan and Germany and so on. Because that was, in fact, in many ways, the most reassuring and comforting. When you were wondering how to cope with the contingencies and the shocks and the dangers associated with the Soviet Union and so forth, it was a comfort to Western policymakers to think, well, it's not so bad. We were able to deal with these things in extremely difficult circumstances in the 1940s. So people like Condoleezza Rice and so on in particular were keen to broaden out the range and to try to unify all of these very diverse situations which I've just been talking about within a single encompassing framework which was intended to be both analytical and normative and legitimizing of what we've come to know of as US forceful and ambitious democracy promotion agenda. Actually, I would say that any careful look at all the different cases and situations I've been describing would suggest, hey, you're going to have a great deal of effort. It's going to take a great deal of work to shovel all that into a single analytical framework, whether cautious or ambitious. Many of these cases are highly contestable. The interpretations at the time may not be the same as the interpretations that prevail either internationally or domestically later on, and there is certainly much more skepticism than there was in the 1990s about all these processes eventually converging on a single uniform outcome, what Philipp Schmitter used to call equifinality. There's much less confidence that we're looking at a cluster of things that result finally, no matter they have different trajectories, result in equifinality. So that, given that, it's very important, and this conference is doing it, and the exercise in Aberystwyth was also very important for saying, well, perhaps we'd better go back to first principles and ask ourselves about the conceptual foundations on which all this rests. And I'm very happy that that's taking place. I think there is a real need for careful, theoretically and analytically sophisticated reflection for the decomposition of the various concepts and terms, and for a counterblast, shall we say, to what for 15 or 20 years was probably, on the whole, highly bureaucratized and insufficiently reflective, and much more about getting a result and justifying a budget and forcing the outcomes into preconceived analytical categories, rather than about asking the deep questions that I think people here are all asking. So what really is this? How does it work? How can we think about it in a more open and reflective and critical manner? So I'm in favour of the conceptual politics side of it, and that's what you've been doing. But in my chapter for the Hobson and Kirky, and in what I'm going to do today, I do stress, and I would underscore, and I think some of you would agree at any rate, that going back to the conceptual foundations, while important, isn't the only thing that needs to be done. And in fact, from my point of view, it's the dialogue between the conceptual analysis which you need to revisit and the empirical evidence, or let's call it the historical experiences that you're trying to cope with. It's the interaction between those two which both makes the subject so exciting and at the same time makes it so elusive and so difficult. It's a two-way flow. Every time you've done your conceptual analysis and you've got your framework more or less in order, something else comes along. You think it was post-communist and neoliberal, and then along comes the Arab Spring or whatever. And this is not just one-off. This is, over the history that I've described since 1945, this is a continuous cycle of surprises coming forward in the realm of democratization, which destabilize pre-established theorizations, and which mean that while the conceptual foundations need to be looked at for their internal consistency and for their genealogy and their coherence, they also need to be probed and tested for their utility in guiding what we're trying to explain and what we're trying to understand, and perhaps, although this is perhaps also in guiding us in any advice we think we're entitled to give about how to handle these processes of democratization. The processes keep erupting according to very powerful internal dynamics which we only partially understand beforehand, and which are not under the control of any external democracy promoter or Western hegemonic project or whatever. That whoever you think the power holders are in this process, they're constantly, just like us, facing the surprise, this isn't what I expected. My colleague Tom Carruthers, who was quite involved with the Conceptual Politics book in Aberystwyth, there he was in Aberystwyth, and there were things happening in Cairo that day, and he needed to know what on earth people in Washington were thinking about the latest news from Cairo. And it's clear that the people that he was doing his international calls in between the analytical discussions, but it's quite clear that although they have in Washington all sorts of privileged sources of information, they also have all kinds of misconceptions, distortions and vested interests, which mean that we were probably better sitting there with a blank slate and saying, well, we don't have the details you have, but we're at least asking the right kind of questions, rather than the other way around. Now, before I go to my metaphors, which I just wanted to show that I do appreciate this conference by making a few very quick comments about I can't do all the papers, but some of the papers that have been presented, which and how I think they relate to what I'm about to do. So, first of all, we had two very conceptually ambitious papers, Joel Lazarus and Michael Murphy, and these range far wider than I do, and in fact they attempt to critique or reconstruct the whole field, not only of democracy promotion, but of what we mean by democracy in the first place, and they revisit foundational questions. Is it a language used to justify US hegemony and the power ambitions of the Westminster elite, is one question. Or is it founded on a Eurocentric tradition of political thought that drowns out the rich democratic potential of other world intellectual and cultural traditions, and that imposes a false set of assumptions about, for example, the isolated individual as the key figure in democracy and democratization? Now, both of those questions are, I think, extremely legitimate in a conceptual debate, but they are huge. And at the end of those papers, I'm still left with the problem, So the next thing is to, having deconstructed other people's ideas, to come out with what the new foundational approach would be. And then, only then, can you derive from that, so what conclusions follow about democracy promotion? That's to say, what positive conclusions follow? You can say that kind of critique undermines your confidence in previous certainties. But it's much harder to go from there to coming up with replacement ways of thinking about what's actually going on. There are other papers that were given. Alistair Brisbane, I think, raised foundational questions as well, but then in his case he brought the argument into focus in a way which I think is, for my purposes, more relevant to what I'm going to do here, by doing deriving from it, a more specific examination of the EU's approach to the Middle East. And in that, talking about the theoretical practical crossover, I found particularly useful his invocation of the Walters on two aspects of anti-politics that he thought characterizes the Brussels technocracy. That is the externalization of effect. Now, the externalization of effect, as I understand it, means that as your EU technocrat or whatever, policymaker, you are blind to the historical and interactive context which has brought about the situation you're dealing with. You're saying, what should I do about Cyprus or Bosnia or whatever, because I'm confronted from the outside with this shock of what's happening and what's demanded of me in that place. But you're not thinking, what has been the historical interactive process which determines what influence, what prestige, and what structural commitments I have in relation to that, and which may distort or blind me to how some of my reactions will be perceived and received at the other end. So I think that externalization of effect idea and the associated point about the emphasis on security, anti-policy being a way of approaching politics which it doesn't focus on achieving a good result. It focuses on fending off a bad thing. If you're going about fending off a bad thing, in a sense, terrorism or whatever it might be, in a sense, a lot of your more difficult dilemmas can be taken. You can take that off the agenda. You can just think. In other words, there are two biases in the way Alistair sees the EU, and my main comment on his paper is that's more general than just the EU. I think we can see the same biases, the anti-politics tendencies, for example, in things that were just said on the last panel about the British and Iraq and the British and Afghanistan, or the things that, well, as one clue, not the only explanation, but one clue to things that we are able to observe about the way the United States formulates its policies. Another paper that I found useful for my purposes was Adam Fagan's references to the elective affinity between democratization and state building, at least elective affinity as conceived by Western policymakers, because by thinking of those two things in the same sort of way, well, that again facilitates using a sort of elite and bureaucratic perspectives, not only for state building but also for democratization. And so you find yourself taking on some assumptions which you've borrowed from state building and you've transferred them to the democracy challenge, but you haven't actually explored whether those assumptions ought to be transferred. And that's separate from the question that I think you rightly raised about whether about state building more generally in any case. Then Jennifer Schmidt, let me just see, sorry. Yes, I've got to find my piece of paper to see what I said about Jennifer Schmidt. Sorry, it's on a different page. Well, perhaps I better go on. I like Jennifer's paper, and I'll speak to her personally about it. But then it was very important to have these two papers on the Philippines and Turkey, from my point of view, because what they do when they say they're historicizing those cases is they are actually standing back from what the West is doing to them and saying, independently of whether you're trying to export democracy or not, what are the characteristics of the long-run, historically grounded characteristics of these democratization processes, and what are their internal difficulties? And a particularly key from my point of view is that that paper also refers to the crucial role of reciprocal causation between the domestic and the international factors. And I think that gets us away from the assumption that you have a passive object being worked on and you have an external actor which is very powerful in shaping that passive object. I think it's the reciprocal causation and the powerful internal dynamics in each society which they bring to the fore, and which is certainly congruent with what I'm going to be saying. Elisa Pires also had something very interesting to offer from the conceptual politics point of view, which was to discuss, looking from the Western end or the US end, the internal resistance to forceful and ambitious efforts at democracy promotion within the liberal tradition. And she usefully distinguished between the empirical difficulties, the policymaker resistances, and the theoretical. I think she was most interested in the theoretical resistances, but she covered all three. And I think that was valuable. However, I would add that despite the importance of the significance of what she's pointing to, and perhaps in the future the growing significance of it, we must remember that even so, it is not the internal resistances which have been prevailing, it is the internal impulses to go ahead and do it anyway, despite these resistances. So that conceptual analysis tells you something, but it needs to be balanced by an analysis of, well, then what is going on, despite these doubts and these reservations, at least at the practical and at the rhetorical level, in causing, I mean, just this week, just look at David Cameron. You'd think it was Tony Blair all over again, and there hadn't been the slightest hesitation or doubt. There's something reproducing itself, and of course Obama has also turned out to be more similar to George W. Bush than his supporters had expected. So the internal resistances are only part of the story there. Now the paper that most directly leads on to what I'm going to now say is the one by Popitin Wolf, because at the one hand it's really concerned at the theoretical conceptual level with the interaction effects between the democracy promoters, I mean the disconnect, shall we say, between what the democracy promoters think they say they should be doing and think they may be doing, and what the recipients of, or the target societies assessment is of the same thing. And this is an important general theme that we must focus on, but it's also a theme which that paper illuminates in a particularly interesting way, because it takes two very recent and significant contemporary cases where I would certainly say in the case of Bolivia we're talking about a democracy, which is, you can criticize Evo Morales' regime, but it's broadly a democracy. By Bolivian standards, it's an impressively democratic regime, which is saying to the United States, you are, in the name of democracy promotion, you are interfering illegitimately in our affairs and we expel you. And it's interesting that the Egyptians, and we can discuss whether the Egyptians are as entitled to speak in the name of democracy in doing this, but it's interesting and important to have the comparison with the Egyptian case. So it's not simply that we're talking in theory about the mismatch between the two, it's that we can actually trace in a rather precise and close way in those two papers how that mismatch unfolds. Now let me turn to the export of democracy. And here I'm switching. Conceptual analysis means that you need some simplifying, coherent, organized framework, and you detach it a little bit from the rich material that it's supposed to apply to, and you ask yourself, how useful and how effective and what's the internal structure of this framework? And the export of democracy was one such framework, and the alternative of the cultivation of democracy, which I'm going to discuss, was another. They're both metaphors, and we have to understand that metaphors are, even more than models, I'd say, are suggestions for hypothesis generation. They are ways of seeing otherwise hidden connections between things, but they are very imperfect. They're not a substitute for the complete and total mapping of what's happening. So the export of democracy has been a successful, but I would say rather far-fetched and misleading metaphor. And if we'd gone back from a conceptual analysis point of view at the beginning and asked about it, we would have said, I would have said, I am now saying what I didn't say in 1990, well, what is an export? Let's just get this clear. An export is the organized dispatch of something, usually a good or service, that the promoting country or the exporting country has, and that the receiving country wishes to obtain. Now, there are qualifications we can say about who's wishing. When I say country, I'm probably referring to a constellation of powers and interests in the country, both the transmitting and the receiving one. I'm not really trying to get into the details of that, but I recognize that all that needs to be fleshed out. But of course, it raises the question of the role of free trade versus managed trade. Some exports are entirely carried out in an environment where the two partner countries are the state political intervention in the trade relationship is pulled back, and free agents pursuing their commercial interests are free to exchange goods and services. But we're dealing with, we're talking about the export of democracy, we're dealing with very asymmetric relationships between countries that are very powerful and perhaps have liberalized their markets very extensively, and other countries which are receivers rather than transmitters, and which may well have defensive interventionist state arrangements. So the role of the government in legitimizing, channeling, authorizing or frustrating exports is almost bound to be an important feature here. At least the role of the receiver government, but I'm also going to highlight the role of the state, of the exporting state as well. Now, an exported good could be delivered ex gratia. It could be that we give it to you for nothing, unrequited for some reason. But normally, and if we're using the metaphor of export, we should be thinking of some kind of compensating good or service being offered in exchange. It might be not fully compensating, but a flow in two directions. So if we're talking about the export of democracy, we need to, the metaphor itself should invite us to ask, so what are the democracy exporters getting back in return? Another feature is that you could have exports where you just have a single product as a single moment of time, you export it, and that's the end of the relationship. But the export of democracy isn't like that. The export of democracy is a flow of transactions. It's each individual item in the transaction is only one component of a longer-term strategy of alliance building and macro restructuring. Therefore, because it's a system, it's not an isolated product, a one-off transaction. It's much wider than that. And therefore, to think about the export of democracy, we need to think also about how the importers may become dependent on the providers who are giving them these goods or who are inducing them to surrender barriers against the receipt of these good things. And we need to think about, and this is classic in economic history, between 19th century economic history was full of the theme of the comprador bourgeoisie. That's to say, as trade spreads to countries where it previously didn't operate, there comes to the fore a new social category of intermediaries whose interests are and whose profits depend on keeping the exchanges going, and who may, in the pursuit of those profits, be much more allied with the exporting country than with the constellation of interests and so on in the importing society. So if we're using the export metaphor, it's raising some, and probing it carefully, it's raising some quite interesting and important questions about how compatible is that with the end product of the export being that the receiving society is restructured to be democratic, rather than the end product of the exporting process is that the receiving country is restructured to be dependent on its external suppliers. Obviously, that's something which, when the Chinese or the Russians react strongly to the export of democracy, the Chinese, for example, have all kinds of reasons for objecting, but one would be that the British opened up the Chinese market by forcing the Chinese to consume opium. That was what we exported before we exported anything else. So these ideas about trade having other consequences are things that the recipient society may have a different view of from the export leading society. In short, the metaphor of export covers a huge range of possible models of transition. Some of them are of translation. Some of them are balanced, as in the liberal idea about free trade, but some of them are cumulatively exploitative or imperialist, and you can't assume just because you're exporting democracy that it will be perceived as a balanced transaction. So we need also to reflect a little bit about, if we're using the export metaphor, about what happens not only to the internal politics of the country receiving the exports, but what happens to the internal power structure of the exporting country. And I'm going to perhaps come back to that later, but it's of course connected with the motives and the interests that are served in the transaction and the reinforcement of a particular set of actors. For example, the reinforcement of the National Endowment for Democracy, if you want to put it that way, as an influential actor in the United States, because those particular things didn't previously have a place in the US bureaucratic system. They got one, they get resources, they get leverage because of the way the United States has become an exporter in this way. So then there's there are the questions. I'm a bit concerned about time. So is it in fact liberal democracy that the West is exporting? I think that various of the papers I've heard today rather take it for granted that we all know that the West is importing liberalism, maybe it's neoliberalism, and that there's a single liberal democratic model that the West knows that it possesses and knows that it could export. And this is certainly what the rhetoric says. This is what Western leaders say, and it's what many of the people who support them believe. And they enter into treaties and so on the basis of this. But I'm not sure that they're as lucid as they should be about what it is they have at home, which they're supposedly exporting. And I have a longer section, I'm going to just skip it actually, about the differences between the characteristics of the different democracy-promoting countries. But I mean, are you promoting US ideas about gun control? Or are you promoting US ideas about federalism? Or are you promoting proportional representation ideas about consensual democratization? What's the nature of the rule of law that you're thinking of exporting? It has been suggested that the rule of law that's being exported is really only and always about property rights. Well, yes, there are certainly powerful rule of law systems in the West that are mainly about property rights, and the US is a good example in the West. But not all Western democracies engaged in democracy promotion are that wedded to private property rights as the central thing. And Scandinavians, who also play a role in democracy promotion, have a somewhat different domestic set of practices, and therefore a somewhat different take on what the components of the rule of law export could be. So there's a great variety there, but perhaps we could say in a restrictive way, well, even if there's a lot of disagreement between Western democracies among themselves about what counts as the things to be exported, there are certain minimum things which they do know, extracted from the context of the rest of their domestic practices, such as honest elections, some ideas about fundamental human rights, and so on, and that these are more widely disseminated and that they can be concentrated on, and that the promotion of democracy can be about that. Well, there is indeed some evidence, and in the 1990s there was quite a bit of work being done to try and homogenize and bring together a community of democracies that would find common ground on at least some of these things. One of the most important observations, however, the last 10 years is that community of democracies' common ground didn't hold together as it was expected to. It didn't unify and gather momentum. If anything, it started unraveling, and it's unraveling more all the time. So, for example, if you're promoting honest elections and the fair count, you've still got to cope with the fact that in Florida, in the year 2000, because of hanging chads, the United States conferred the presidency on the person who got a minority of the popular vote rather than the candidate who got the majority of the popular vote. So there's a mismatch here, isn't there? And this starts undermining people's, the West's unity about, or similarly, well, okay, at least we can agree that democracy is about fundamental human rights. So at least we can agree that democracy is not about, shall we say, torturing people. Oh, that's a bit awkward, isn't it? Because it turns out that, well, the Western democracies aren't absolutely so clear in their own mind that under no circumstances could you have waterboarding, or under no circumstances could you put people disappear them legally into Guantanamo and leave them there for 10 years. So the relationship between what's going on at home and what's exported is a bit more, needs a bit more work, doesn't it? Then there's the method of export, and I've already mentioned that I had 4 suggestions. There's the coercive method, that since we're powerful and since we've got the right answer and since you're not accepting our answer, we'll go and send an army and crush anybody who stands in our way, and then we'll give you democracy. Well, I'm not going to, everybody here I'm sure is, it doesn't need me to talk about the practical dangers of that, but also at the conceptual level, it's pretty, if it isn't exactly self-contradictory, it's pretty close to self-contradictory as a concept, isn't it? So that then leaves us to a longer discussion, for which I do not have the time, about alternative methods. Let me illustrate. Coercion doesn't necessarily mean invasion. You could try to promote democracy by using economic sanctions. And in fact, economic sanctions figure quite prominently in the arsenal of democracy promotion agendas. Now, but how do economic sanctions work? There's how they're supposed to work and how they actually work. How they're supposed to work is that they bring such pressure to bear on the anti-democratic elites that their internal cohesion collapses and the regime disintegrates. But what we can observe, and what studies of this, repeatedly show, is that you can end up with long-term, cumulative, sustained economic sanctions which do not bring down the authoritarian enemy. They push them together and make them a tighter, more conspiratorial group perhaps, but which do damage and destabilize and disrupt the civil society in those countries, which would be what you would need if there was to be powerful surges of democratization from within. So here's another instrument which at least is open to more critical examination than we've given it. Then, of course, there's the soft power solutions. Now, one of the things about the soft power options, this is where contagion and consent come in my model. There's a range of different things covered by soft power, and this is not the place to decompose them. But what we need to be lucid about the different consequences of the different forms of soft power that may be deployed. So some of them may be actually, for example, promoting a secular category in a religious society through educational and media examples. That would be one thing. And that might be a good thing. I'm not saying it isn't, but you can well understand that it can produce a backlash. And indeed, if you want to understand, why the Iranians have the view they have, well, there were efforts to use soft power to, under the Shah and so on, to secularize, which produced the consequences that we know. I haven't got time to go on with my discussions about the differences between the methods, but each of the methods that you could use to export democracy has different implications. Now, let's look at the recipient end. What is it that the recipient's going to get? Is it one single thing, or is it a variety of things? And if it's going to get those variety of things, how is that going to come through? It could be that they're going to get clean elections. Again, I need to look for my piece of paper. Oh dear. Could be that they're going to get clean elections. It could be they're going to get government accountability. It could be they're going to get basic rights, rule of law, and it could even be that they're getting self-government. Those are the different kinds of areas where, if you're exporting democracy and you want to know, is it arriving at the other end, those are some of the things that we would look at. Well, however, I just mentioned the case of clean elections producing Hamas in Palestine. At that point, it's not quite so clear, is it, that democracy promotion is that desired by the promoters if it's that kind of clean election. Government accountability is fine, so long as the people to whom the government is held accountable include the foreign investors, multinational corporations, and so on. Government accountability to domestic constituencies that don't like foreign investors, well, that's actually a little bit more problematic, isn't it? Rule of law, time is not going to commit me to go into all of these. Let me just mention with the clean elections that one of the most spectacular examples of US democracy promotion is the Helms-Burton Act of 1996, which says we will never lift sanctions or in any way stop harassing the Cuban regime, the communist regime in Cuba, no matter what else it does, until it holds clean elections. And it is the US Congress which will determine what those clean elections must contain. And one thing that the US Congress is stipulating by law in advance and binding the president to is that could not include the election to a position of leadership of any member of the Castro family. So clean elections, you can have them, but on our terms. Supposing it was the case, and I'm not saying it is, but supposing it was a case that in a clean election, Cubans would actually say, well, I will vote for the Castros. In that case, it would not be unacceptable. From the point of view of Helms-Burton, it would not count as... all right. So I've gone on about the difficulties and the contradictions and the confusions in the export of democracy. Let me finally make a few very brief points about the merits of switching from the export metaphor to the cultivation metaphor. Now, given these difficulties with the export metaphor, it makes sense to search for some alternative framing device. The cultivation metaphor recognizes that democracy grows from within and from below, and that it can take multiple forms, and that and the metaphor also highlights the diversity, pluralism, and creativity that is needed for democracy to flourish within an overall framework of order. There still has to be an overall framework of order. I'm not going to deny that. So the cultivation metaphor allows different niches within the area being cultivated, each reflecting perhaps local traditions, local climatic conditions, local factor endowments, and so on. It recognizes that what grows well on wet, acidic soil is different from what grows in sandy alkali soil. It shows that helping democracy requires, and this is the cultivation point as a contrast to the export case, it requires persistence and focus, and it requires time and dedication. If you're going to cultivate a good garden, you're not going to get it the day after. You're going to need to bring the expertise to bear continually. You're going to have to respond to by trial and error to the good results and the bad results, and so there are some merits in this, and I think this metaphor has some advantages over the more mechanistic or institutional design perspective, or the one-stop holistic image of democratization that has prevailed in the export model. It underscores that the helper, if there is to be a helper, must give something of himself in order to maintain a pleasing garden, or a pleasing outcome, as it were, which will need, and that outcome will need, to be tended across the seasons rather than just soundbite, we've done it, we will pull out the troops, and that's the end of it. Okay, so there you can see that I can make some points, and the chapter makes some points in favour of that alternative metaphor. But I want to end with two more points. First, the realities I described at the beginning are so diverse and complex that not even my improved metaphor is going to encompass all the things that we need. It's a way of testing and challenging considered assumptions and the other way of thinking. So it's a way of loosening up our thought processes rather than a rigid alternative must-have framework that's got to be imposed. Finally, well, even with the metaphor of cultivation, we are still stuck with the reality which several people, I think, said earlier on. Even democracy is a form of domination. It's a system of rule which imposes order. Maybe the order has the great merit that it allows more freedom and participation and flexibility than the alternatives, but it imposes an order which must be maintained and defended, and which must therefore also include a capacity to sanction anti-system, or in Rawls's international case, it's outlaw states. In the other discourses, we can talk about terrorism, organised crime, or whatever. But anyway, whatever it used to be communism, there is going to be always, for any democratic regime, some potential positions, discourses and interests which are threatened by it, which are excluded by it, and which would like, well, if they learn that they can achieve enough of what they want by participating from within, then they can contribute to the garden, that's all right. But there will always be some who say, I want to tear down the fence, I want to let in the parasites, I want to devastate this garden that you're cultivating. And the metaphor must not therefore be taken as suggesting that everything is always to be done in a gentle and a consensual way, and there are no tough power-related decisions that may be required in order to both promote democracy where it doesn't exist and defend it where, in the cases we're talking about, with a limited amount of external help, but above all, growing from within, it's beginning to take root. That's me.
Thank you very much. We've got about time for about 15 minutes questions, so if people can, we'll take one at a time. Okay.
Thank you very much for that fascinating and incredibly talk. I want to pick up on something which you've also raised in the question from another speaker, which is the problems posed from US national interest and lots of other interests as well, like what with suicide bombing, of a massive victory for democracy promotion. Now, people who, there's not quite a few, who argue that democracy in Palestinian area or in the Arab world won't lead to a victory of Islamist anti-Semites trying to wipe them on the map. The argument that's given is that wasn't an entirely fair election, in that you had Hamas and Fatah had the ability to actually run proper campaigns. It was heavily biased in favour of Fatah because their policies and their ideology and their record were less popular, they lost. But no one else could. Essentially, you had only two political parties that had armed militias and could run. I mean, to what degree do you accept that factually? And to what degree do you think that sort of fits into the aspect in an important way in terms of people, there has to be an ability to have more than two options. Multiple options have to be able to be put on the table, and as a sort of defining feature of democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to have a democracy in Palestine. It doesn't have its state isn't constituted, so there's a large proportion of Palestinian potential voters who are living in refugee camps outside Israel altogether, and they are at the mercy of the various power structures and nations that they're in. You know, to be a Palestinian in Syria is one thing, to be a Palestinian in Lebanon is something else, and so on. But the theory is that you wanted a leadership that would represent the Palestinian people. And the assumption behind the operation, as I understand it, I'm not an expert, but I'll give you my best understanding of the case. The Bush administration, in its pursuit of democracy in the Greater Middle East, believed that with its help, Fatah, under its control and carefully monitored by the Israelis, would prevail and would be legitimized through an election, which would then enable a lopsided settlement to arise, and the United States would. It was something along those lines. Now, what actually happened was that, and I'm open to two interpretations about why it happened. There were two places where the election took place. One is the West Bank, and the other is Gaza. And there's no, they are very different, both sociologically and geopolitically. And the Fatah control over the West Bank, which would have given them a facade election of the kind that the US wanted, it proved impossible to create such a fake appearance of voluntary support for Fatah in Gaza. And in order to break that, it required violence. And the Fatah people were driven out, and some of them were killed. And so, in that sense, it wasn't a democratic election, or at least it was a very problematic. However, if you looked at it from the point of view of the EU rather than the US approach to the Palestinians, there was the possibility of supporting a process that would, for the first time, allow the Palestinian people a say, and that would give an impulse to the Oslo process. It was the failure of the EU, as much as the internal dynamics, that it turned out the way it did. So I'm giving you a rather too detailed, but perhaps from the purpose of this conference, the key point is each of these cases requires ever so careful contextualization. They can't be judged in isolation from the broader historical background and the much wider range of interests that are at stake, but they contain the possibility for progress, not as well as the very great danger of...
One quite important factual point is just in terms of the details of that, I found a lot of that writing, is I think Hamas actually won the West Bank as well. They certainly
okay, you're right, yes.
If they didn't.
Fatah then did the coup. Fatah then put all of Hamas elected people in jail. So whether Hamas has completely won in West Bank, I don't know. It certainly had a strength in the West Bank which was crushed by Fatah in partnership with... So that reinforces the hypocrisy, and it also means that it was more of a change of direction for the United States, because this was completely not on the script for the US.
Please.
I make no apology really for being more familiar with your earlier work than some of the later work, but I think I'd like to thank you for taking us back to certainly the 1986 comparative work and also the work you did in the 90s, because it seems to me that what you confirmed in the lecture, and also what I've been sort of thinking about throughout the day really, is what is the problem perhaps that at some point, and it's probably during the 1990s, democracy as assisting processes that were reasonably well underway and to use the cliche, pushing open doors, as it were, became democracy promotion, and an altogether different endeavour. But also going back to the 86 book and reading about Latin America, and then a few years later reading about Central Eastern Europe, although there had been the end of the Cold War, there wasn't the explicit or overt sense that this was a universal export, that it was going to be a global export. And I wonder really whether that's really that somehow we see this continuity, but actually we're just talking about two very different things in a way. And I just wondered if you had anything to say.
Well, I think other people have been talking about the issue of continuity and its limitations in macro historical and theoretical terms. There is some continuity. between what was happening in the 1980s and later on. But there are also, as I suggested in my opening remarks, a constant series of empirical and real-life experience surprises which destabilize preceding assumptions. So in the 1980s, the assumption was there wouldn't be that many democratizations, but they'd really matter. By the 1990s, the assumption changed. Oh, well, there's going to be lots of them, but they're not going to produce the far-reaching, rich, fully participative models of full progress that the original theorists had been dealing with. There's I would say evolution rather than complete discontinuity over time. The Latin American ones continue to cast a long shadow forward right the way up to the present in contemporary Latin America, but they also continue to have relevance for other places. Not perhaps easy to make the case that there was a whole debate about whether the Latin American lessons were transmittable or how far they were transmittable to Eastern Europe, and there were people who said, like Val Bunt said, transitology doesn't transit, as it were, geographically. But actually, this is the wrong way to think about it. As a completely self-contained and rigid package, of course it wouldn't apply elsewhere. But as a disposition, a series of hypotheses and insights which would modify your otherwise rather limited generalizations based on local knowledge, and that would open up the possibilities for a more interesting and rich discursive reflexivity. I think that it did travel. It does travel. It continues to travel now. I mean, it's fascinating the number of my old buddies who turn up in Tahrir Square, who can't speak Arabic, so there are sort of problems with what they think they're seeing. But they are welcomed, and there is something going on there which has a degree of continuity as well as a very important degree of novelty. And there are ways in which what is happening, say in North Africa, feeds back into and alters one's ideas and the objective possibilities for democratization and the evolution of democracy in the other countries too.
I have one final question. Oh, please go for it, Joel.
No, I was just going to kind of interrogate the culture. I think it's obviously a light year advancement from export, but it's ultimately still, the gardener tending the garden, still the subject, the object, and I just wonder, with cultivation, what happens with, when is a flower a weed?
Absolutely.
And who judges?
Who judges is the key
aesthetic?
question. Yes.
Or who's politics? Who's aesthetic? What about invasive species? I know. And look at man's destruction of his own natural environment. So, I think, as I say, I think it is a very fruitful.
I didn't have time to follow up one of the points. It's not the only. I'm not claiming that this is the solution to all problems. I'm claiming that if you're thinking about the comparative modelling of governments that believe themselves to be democratic and believe they're helping others to become democratic, then this may be a more a rival and constructive alternative to the export framework. But it does raise the question, of course, who judges? And this is where the word consent is rather important in the international dimensions. For me, the most important ultimate criterion of whether a democratic outcome is successful or not is, do the people who we are supposed to have democratized believe, to give their consent, that this is a good democratic regime which has come into existence, and that they wish to support and live under it. Now that's not just an internal, that's partly the garden growing up from within, but it's also reinforced by the sense that they are participating in a wider aesthetic, if you want to call it that, a wider community of peoples who appreciate these ways of configuring the relationship between man and nature, in this case. And so the Hugh Judges is partly the people who live within the society, that's the democratic sovereignty test, if you like, but they are open and influenced by the currents of the cosmopolitan, if you want to call it, or international and global currents of opinion, which are much more powerful now than they were in the 1980s. So, you know, people will say if you treat, if you lop off the hand of a thief in Egypt or Mali or whatever, that will not only raise questions about how democratic your conduct is inside Mali to the people of Mali, but it will raise questions for Malians, knowing the shock reactions that produces from the democratic world outside. So, but there is also the question who judges, you know, ultimately my metaphor might get misappropriated as saying, here is the world's best gardener, the United Nations Secretary General will appoint him and give him plenipotentiary powers, and you must all live in that garden. That's not where I want to go.
Let's make one very quick comment.
One quick one.
A garden maybe with two gardeners.
Yeah.
And if they make it into a cooperative process between the people whose garden location is and the others who want to help them cultivate it.
So that's the community of democracies idea, really. It could be two, it could be many. It's a community of people who are experts in knowing how to do this, who support one another, and who have good results which are appreciated locally.
Yeah, I mean, one garden being the promoting supporting state and the other being the indigenous population.
On that note, I don't want to hold you back from the drink, so thank you so much, Laurence.